Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and for bearing with what I believe is hideous traffic. Don't blame us. Blame the fact that this city, I think, has about 10,000 track 1.5, track 2s, and everything else going on today. So I'm truly delighted and very honored to have so many of you in the room for our contribution to the Mela that Delhi is currently being witness to. I think our moderator in chief for this morning is also caught in one of those traffic jams. He is right around the corner, which basically means that whenever you're really close to where you need to go, you'll be the last one to show up, and he's probably got stuck in some hideous traffic on the way too. So we'll begin, since so many of you have made the effort to be here on time, and many of you were here before time. I thought we shouldn't wait too long. We'll begin, and as soon as Ashok joins, he can take over from me. Just to introduce today's discussion, it's a real privilege and honor for me to have such an esteemed group of speakers here today to talk about a really exciting report on Indo-US relations. The report itself describes itself talking about India and the United States as an indispensable partnership. This, I think, is quite a step forward from generations previous to us that have framed the India-US partnership in different ways. But in the last decade or so, the Indo-US partnership has been strategic, important, and I think what this report is trying to do is to push the envelope a little further to redefine this relationship. It also comes at a time of great turmoil, both in the United States and the globe, and India is not hasn't escaped that turmoil either. So, placing bilateral relationships in the context of a changing global scenario, I think, has been one of the big challenges of this report. But to my mind, what's been most exciting, and I must reveal that I am a member of this task force, is that this task force has sought not just to talk about bilateral relations in traditional terms, strategic, defense, economic, but really push the envelope to look at a much wider range of issues. This was my first experience in dealing with bilateral dialogues, track two dialogues. My own work has mostly been on domestic policy and issues of democracy and governance in the context of India. So it was it was quite an experience for me to be part of a much broader conversation using the tools that I've been familiar with and the vocabulary and language and grammar that I've been familiar with on the domestic front to really place it in an international context. And I can't think of that many efforts at thinking about bilateral relationships that really do push the envelope to open up. Ah, fantastic. Ashok is here as well. So with that, I just wanted to um, come on in. Just wanted to introduce the two co-chairs of the task force, Ambassador Rao and Ambassador Verma, both of whom don't need much introduction in this audience, but they've been members of this task force in their new avatars. Ambassador Rao as a whirling dervish. I couldn't imagine a better way to be footloose and fancy free and enjoying both engaging with questions of foreign policy and pursuing many other of her many talents. And Ambassador Verma, who's taken the host of his experiences and is now training the next generation of foreign policy leaders at Georgetown University. It's been a real honor and pleasure for us at the task force to have had the opportunity to work with both of them, but also to have the opportunity to work with so many members of the task force who are here today. I'm delighted to be able to formally welcome you to the Center for Policy Research, and thank you especially to CAP for putting this task force together and giving so many of us the opportunity to learn from each other and to engage in a meaningful conversation about the future of bilateral relations. And last but not least, our moderator for this morning, Ashok Malik, who was a member of this task force until he went on to do bigger and better things serving our country. So, Ashok, thank you so much for coming and for being here. Over to you. Since we didn't get a chance to speak, just on format, Ambassador Rao and Ambassador Verma will just give a few opening remarks to set the context of the report, and Ashok will then walk us through a moderated conversation before we open up for questions. So thanks all, and over to you, Ashok.
Thank you, Yamini. Thank you, Ambassador Rao. Thank you, Ambassador Verma. Thank you, CAP. Thank you, CPR. Thank you, everyone. Sorry to keep everyone waiting. One of the things you very quickly learn when you join government, and I'm sitting with two veterans here, I recognize that, is that you only get to leave a room when your boss leaves. So you have to wait for him to leave and pray that he leaves before he's scheduled to leave, and doesn't delay his departure, and only then can you leave. So I had to wait for my boss to leave for somewhere, and he decided to be a little leisurely about it, and he was 5 minutes late, and that got me a little late as well. I'm sorry. So this task force had 20 members. I am the invisible 20 and the halfth member. I was a member for half the period, and it was a very productive meeting, a set of meetings we had in Delhi, and we were all set for the even more productive set of meetings in DC when the government shanghaied me. But believe me, government is fun, but doing this is much more fun, okay? Because you don't have the restrictions of working within one term or one presidency or one prime ministerial sort of bandwidth. You can really have an open sky discussion and make recommendations for not just 2-3 years, but for several years. And this is what this very slim, well-written, concise, and fairly precise and realistic report has done. And I must congratulate both Ambassador Verma and Ambassador Rao and everybody else at CAP for producing this. So let me start by asking Ambassador Rao to make her opening remarks and give us her assessment in about 5 or 7 minutes of the report, and then I'll do the same with Ambassador Verma.
Thank you, Ashok. And your presence was certainly missed when we were putting this report together. And thank you, Yamini, for your opening remarks. Most of you would, I'm sure, have at least scanned through the introduction or the summary of recommendations in the report. And perhaps during the time we've set apart for discussion, we could go into that in greater depth and detail. So I don't want to take too much of your time, but to say that obviously all of us realize we live in a time of shifting sands geopolitically, geoeconomically. And what we've tried to do through this report and through the discussions we've had is to see how we can anchor this relationship between India and the United States within this scenario. And we've taken inspiration, we've drawn hope from the fact that this relationship has made great strides in the last decade and a half, and there is much to be optimistic about and to be hopeful about when we look at the future of this relationship. So we decided that despite these shifting sands around us, this is a time for renewal, a time for expansion, and a time to define a vision for the future of this relationship. And why do we say that? I think the very fact that this report and the fact that we drew together experts from diverse fields, and diverse fields very much at the grassroots of human life and development, as it were, not just in foreign affairs, not just in global politics, but people concerned with development, concerned with energy, concerned with democratic governance, concerned with health, concerned with education, women's empowerment. We were able to draw all these diverse threads together in our discussions. We had our differences of opinion, but I think the good thing about what we've achieved is that we were able to build great common ground, and we've put together recommendations that I believe are useful, are practical, that are implementable when you look to the path ahead for this relationship. central to our focus and our emphasis was the fact that we're looking at the aspirations of people in both countries, the democratic quotient, as it were. In India, we talk of a demographic dividend, we talk of the young people coming into the job market. But I think we also must understand that we must create from this demographic dividend a democratic dividend also. And that is why when we speak of jobs and opportunities that's one of the first areas of recommendation in this report. We're looking at the future of work. We've talked of a future of work dialogue. What happens when you have increased automation in industry? What happens to our Make in India program? What happens to Making America Great Again? How do we chart a course forward that can actually translate into concrete benefits for these young people and address their aspirations, because we live in a revolution of rising expectations in both countries. And the political dynamic, the socio-political dynamic that we see unfolding in both our nations would suggest this this trend of rising expectations. And how do governments in both countries meet this? And how, through this process, do we ensure that there is stability in our relationship? I know that sometimes our aims may not exactly coincide, and sometimes the interests that we seek to promote may not exactly mirror each other. But underlying all this is the need for us not only to sustain that growth, to meet those expectations, but also build on the progress we've made in this relationship in the last 10, 15 years. And so drawing from that, very linked to that, organically linked to that, and this is not just an academic report that we've put together, and we certainly don't intend that it should gather dust in some archive. We hope that it will receive the attention of the two establishments, and that it will be written about, that it will be discussed, debated, improved upon, certainly. There's always scope for improvement and for redefining some of the nuances. But let's talk about jobs, let's talk about opportunities for the young people, let's talk about energy efficiency, which is a major part of the recommendations that we've made, climate modeling, renewable energy. Let's advocate more strongly the need for the United States to remain a part of the Paris Climate Agreements. Let's draw the United States into the International Solar Alliance. Let's look at grid modernization, energy efficiency in India particularly. Let's draw US investment into these areas. I think that is what we need to see happening much more. We've looked at smart cities. We would like safe cities too. With the smart cities, we'd like to upgrade the level of security available for our people, better transportation, infrastructure, digital communication, and that's where the intersection of internet and governance comes in, democracy and technology, openness, transparency, what is the intersection of big data and privacy. We've tried to touch upon all these areas. It's a brief report, but we've certainly highlighted some of these areas that need much greater focus from both countries. We've looked at security, we've looked at the Indo-Pacific, the oceans around us. Some people say from Bollywood to Hollywood. The fact is that the Indo-Pacific, as it's come to be defined, in a sense supersedes what we used to call the Asia-Pacific. And where do our two nations position ourselves in this situation, in this environment, where we have to ensure quick responses, efficient responses in sometimes contested domains, in the field of maritime security, in the field of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and how, and this is something we came up in our discussions, how do we create, given the fact that this is a natural partnership, an indispensable democratic partnership between India and the United States, how do we create a strategic advantage for India that will enable it to achieve I think its rightful potential in this region? And of course, nobody can ignore the elephant in the room or the dragon in the room. I remember those old maps that spoke of there lie dragons, and you have, the Chinese all around us. We cannot escape, focus on that issue. And I think our dialogue, the US and India, is increasingly beginning to focus much more intensively on this phenomenon, on this reality. And how do we increase that democratic partnership between like minded nations in the region, like Japan, Australia, some of the ASEAN countries, in building a structure of security and economic, uh, two-way communication in this region that factors in the rise of China, but enables a much more orderly, much more defined, much more code of conduct oriented set of rules for managing this emerging scenario in the Indo-Pacific. And together with that, when you talk of building the strategic advantage for India, we are looking at defense procurements, creating systems that permit more easy, more smooth transfer of technology, and even one umbrella defense implementation agreement that will look at information sharing, interoperability, among other things. I know it will not be easy. There are attitudes that we have to overcome in both countries. There are, those hesitations of history do remain in certain areas. They haven't completely been erased. And we will have to look at how we can reform and we can improve and we can change attitudes that hinder some of the progress that we would like to see achieved in these areas. When you talk to American businessmen or you talk to American congressmen, some opinion in the United States would seem to suggest that India has a free ride in some of these areas, that India needs to take on more obligations. And on the Indian side, we remember the past, we remember the hindrances and the obstacles we faced, and they're not easily set aside. So there are tasks ahead, there are challenges ahead that we have to overcome. But I believe that these, need focus, need examination, and we can find a way forward. We are optimistic about the future. And we've also spoken about the people to people dimension, apart from trade and business, of course, where, so many issues still remain to be decided. We haven't really wandered into the area of talking about whether we need a bilateral investment agreement or a free trade agreement. Everything is churning in that area. Trade between our two countries has grown phenomenally in the last 10 years, I'd say. But then when you go to the US, they talk about the $30 billion trade deficit with India. But with a $16 trillion economy, the world's biggest economy, you sometimes wonder whether that $30 billion deficit is really going to, deter the US from making itself great again. But these are issues that we need to factor into. We have our concerns about the H-1B visas, the movement of professionals, the mood in US Congress, the whole issue of creating jobs for Americans, taxation reform that may affect some of our IT companies, that very well may affect some of our IT companies. So, this is a complex relationship. It's not just, we can't be Pollyannas about it, certainly not, but we have to, and I think we've found a way of working together. We've found a certain comfort level in addressing issues candidly, frankly, and openly, and I think that should provide a great measure of confidence for us. We also focused on, awareness creation, opinion, influencing public opinion, the lack of awareness, the fact that so few American students come to study in India. What do we need to do about our higher education institutions to attract that kind of component of American scholarship that we see happening vis-a-vis China, for instance, between the United States and China? And how do we make it easier for research to happen? How do we make it easier for Indian scholars to travel to the United States to access the benefits of research and the information availability in your higher education institutions? We had good meetings in Bombay yesterday. We were at the Gateway House and we met with a cross-section of intellectuals also in a meeting organized by the US Consul General. And I think that in itself threw up very good ideas that in a way, make us understand that there is so much more that we can do about this relationship, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in technology transfer, whether it's just in removing these obstacles. So there's work ahead. Our work is not yet finished, but we have this report before you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Rao, for an excellent overview of what is really a very practical, down-to-earth, and realistic report and assessment of Indo-US relations and their potential. I now move to Ambassador Verma.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. Let me thank our hosts for welcoming us. Let me thank the Center for American Progress team for a really outstanding job, and I want to make sure I recognize some of the folks here. Mike Fuchs, there's Mike in the room. Where's Mike? Mike, raise your hand. So Mike, senior State Department official and expert on Asia, and we benefited greatly from his leadership, a lot of his writing and drafting. We also had two very senior Pentagon officials working with us as part of the team, former Pentagon officials, I should say, Kelly Magisman and Vikram Singh, sitting at the corner here. Couldn't think of a finer group from CAP as well. Two of our task force members are here. Rick Rosso, there he is. Everyone knows Rick and his India States Weekly. Did I get it right? I read it. I wait for it. I wait for the tweet to come out. Thanks for all that you've done. And Noor Lack, Noor, raise your hand in the back here. An amazing assemblage of folks on this team. One of the great things about the team is that it was mainly non-government, and that's a good thing. And we had so many diverse views: private sector, civil society, energy sector, and that really helped out a lot. Let me also thank our U.S. Embassy team that is here. I see them scattered around the room, and it's great to see them. They used to worry about what I would say at moments like this, and now they can't control what I say, which is even better. Actually, I probably preferred it the other way when I knew what I was talking about, but it was because of their incredible service and sacrifice. And one thing that you will learn when you're posted overseas is that we have an amazing group of civil servants, of foreign service officers, of defense professionals, people from across our government, the families, the dependents that come out and work really hard, unsung heroes in this relationship for decades, and I was really proud to get to know them and get to work with them. It's funny, we were talking about the bad traffic before you came in, and some of the folks that were delayed, and one of my last kind of memories was being stuck in the car with Secretary Kerry for about 2 hours in really bad traffic. And for the last hour of that journey, we could see our hotel, the Leela Palace. It was about a half mile from where we were supposed to get. And I was trying to change the subject with him because he wanted to get out of the car and walk to the hotel. And we covered the New England Patriots, the Red Sox, we downloaded songs on Hamilton, the Broadway show. So one of my achievements was preventing a big diplomatic incident and having the Secretary of State walk to his hotel. So we know what the traffic can be like. I won't go through all the recommendations. I'll just say, and I was serious, Rick, about reading your stuff, and you may remember I told you this. When you're in government, you wait for people to write about the U.S.-India relationship, and you read it because you want new ideas. You want fresh people coming at this because we are so stuck and consumed by the day-to-day. And I really do appreciate Ambassador Juster's really terrific speech of last week where he laid out a vision for the future. I think that exercise was really important, and a number of people have commented to us that there's a number of overlapping subjects, which is terrific. But what we tried to do was create a report here that is, it's not 200 pages, it's just 30 or 40 pages. Some of the ideas are big ideas, right? Creating a strategic edge for India internationally. That's a big deal. That's a big idea. That would be a major change in U.S. policy. that would be not only getting rid of the hyphen and counterbalancing, that would be really putting our weight behind India and making sure it has the technological and defense platforms and related support it needs to prevail in contested domains. That's a big idea. Now, that idea could translate into a 200-page report in and of itself, but we put it out there to say this relationship is on a good track, and for 2 decades it's been on an upward trajectory, but it has also performed. I think those of us that care and love this relationship have to recognize that it has not performed the way it could and should. So we tried to look at those pieces of the relationship that we could put in place today, that in 5 or 10 years we could look back and say, we are living up to those big aspirations, defining partnership of the 21st century, natural allies, best partners, whatever phrase you want to put on it. We want to be able to live up to it, and that's the frame, and that's the spirit of our recommendations. Ambassador Rao talked about the shifting geopolitical sands that we're living in, and I do think this is a very timely and important time to be thinking about this relationship. More aggressive and assertive China, Western influence waning, the U.S. role in Asia, that chapter is not yet written, what the next few years are going to bring. And certainly there is a strong gravitational pull within the country to bring back not just troops and kind of aid and assistance packages, but to take the U.S. influence and make sure that, as the President says, we focus on America first. That will have an impact globally. So there are some shifting sands. And, I think the hope is that India rises in this period. And we want that to happen. And we want to be a closer partner. The overall thesis and theory of the report is that working together, both of our paths in the next decade and 2 decades will be better if we are the closest of friends and partners. I will say one of the interesting exercises we went through, and it's in the report, are the perceptions we have of each other. And I think until you do this, you won't know what are the obstacles. And we really sat down and had very honest conversations. And some of the Indian perceptions, you've heard these, but I'll just say a few of them. The U.S. is not a reliable partner. Depending on who I talk to in the government, sometimes they'll start in the year 1971 and go forward about how we're not a reliable partner. The Indian perception is that we don't take into account all that India does in the Indo-Pacific region to project power and to deter bad actors. We often ask India to do things that are not in its domestic interests, that we don't take into account some of its economic and development challenges. And then on the U.S. side, the perception that India is a free rider in the international system, wants the benefits without the cost. It's still, the reform process is too long, it's still too difficult to do business here. So, look, that was an important exercise, but I think the reason we were able to plow through all that is because we also came to the conclusion that we need each other, that we are stronger together. And as the Prime Minister told the Congress last year, that it is in America's long-term interest for India to be strong and prosperous. That's what fuels the driving kind of foundation of the report. I was really proud to be a member, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. One of the things that struck me about this report was the honest and earnest effort made to actually look beyond the immediate and to look at what I could loosely call 21st century issues. I've been involved in structured Indo-US discussions at the track 2 or track 1.5 level about 12 or 15 years now. And frankly, much of the conversation has been taken up by terrorism, South Asia, Central Asia, and inevitably Pakistan. And of course, as Ambassador Verma suggests, there's always a reference to USS Enterprise in 71, there's always a reference to Pokhran in 74, and then everyone talks about Afghanistan and Pakistan, and conversation ends. This report has made an earnest effort to get out of that box, to look ahead, because the rest of the 21st century isn't going to be about what the first 15 or 16 years of the 21st century have been about. At least we hope the rest of the century is not like this. The rest of the century is not going to be about the South Asia, Central Asia box and all of that. Geographically, this report recognizes that India or Indo-US relations are now global, and if they have a regional context, it is the Indo-Pacific more than just the South Asia box or Central Asia box, and that's something I'd like both the ambassadors to speak about. There's also an honest effort to build human capacities in both countries beyond just a transactional, we sell you this and you buy this from us. The reference to democracy and technology, which I found very fascinating and interesting, which is a challenge for all democracies. It's also an opportunity, I guess, but it is a challenge. The reference to building education capacities in India and also giving access to Indian students, greater access to Indian students in the US. The reference to clean energy and ambitious at this moment, but I think well-intentioned. The recommendation that the US be brought into the ISA. All of these were absolutely fascinating, but Ambassador Verma, if I could start with you. The US has had this internal debate for years about where to place India geographically. Is it South Asia? Is it South and Central Asia? The State Department's had one view, the Pentagon has had another. Has that debate, you'd say, finally been settled with seeing India as part of the Indo-Pacific?
Well, look, I think Indo-Pacific is the term that's being used, and I know it's been used by the Secretary of State and others, and I think it's the right term, and it helps define kind of India's broader role. Whether we've resolved where India fits, is it more part of South and Central Asia? Is it more part of the Asia Pacific? I think is a interesting kind of bureaucratic exercise. I'm not. I think it kind of misses the larger story, which is India rising. India's risen, depending on what sector you look at. But I think whichever bureaucratic box you choose to put it in, I think the bigger story is about India's global rise, India's role in democratic institutions, India playing a driving force and being part of the discussion on setting the norms in this century. Too often we look at and talk about the post-World War II order, but those institutions and those norms were developed by the victors of World War II. Those institutions were designed not with a rising India in mind. And look, India should have a seat on a reformed UN Security Council. India should be part of APEC. All these things we talk about. And it's a little bit of a push and a pull. We want these things to happen for India, but we also want India to demonstrate that it wants these things for itself as well. We can't want some of these things more than India wants them. And sometimes that is what we do confront. And some of that is just from wanting to be enthusiastic about supporting India's rise. And look, there's so much promise about this time ahead for India. I'll just say final thought about our cooperation across the Indo-Pacific. And I really do think we've come such a long way. I remember probably 5 or 6 years ago, we couldn't say the word interoperability. If you talked about systems that were interoperable, you somehow had crossed some very bad Rubicon in the defense space, and people would say, no, we can't talk to each other on our radios. Our systems don't operate together because we would never do anything jointly. We've come so far from that. Someone just go and watch one of our defense exercises, right? If you're ever feeling depressed about the state of the world, you will come out of one of the defense exercises feeling very encouraged about the world. And I will tell you, whether they are special operators or U.S. Army troops or U.S. Air Force troops or U.S. Naval personnel, they are doing very kinetic things together. And they are practicing and planning for very challenging situations. That is exactly what we would expect. That is a vision for the future that suggests greater peace and prosperity is possible because our two countries can actually deter bad actors and bad things from happening and challenging the world order which we have come to depend upon. So I'm actually quite encouraged by that. I actually do believe what the Prime Minister said about overcoming the hesitations of history. We're not fully there, but we're on a good path.
Master Rao, to use the expression Ambassador Verma just did, the hesitations of history, we both had hesitations of different kinds. One of the hesitations the Indian side has had has frankly been a hesitation of the defense establishment over years, over decades. How far have we come in overcoming that, and why are you optimistic about your report?
Well, I would draw a reference first from what you said in your remarks about this relationship as drawn up in the report being about 21st century issues. And it's all very well to speak about the hesitations of history or about 1971, and I know that some of those memories still linger. They don't go away so easily. But I think what the last 10 years have demonstrated is that there is a growing comfort level between the two establishments in both countries, including the defense establishments, in dealing with each other. If at all I've encountered doubts or hesitations, it's perhaps more in the political establishment. I think, and that draws connections and references to, yes, what happened in the past. I think politicians don't forget the past so easily. And that then comes to influence decision-making from my own experience of these issues. I don't believe it's at the working level so much, particularly at the defense establishment level. I believe, there's willingness to be more open and to explore the unknown a little more confidently. And that's why you have talk of interoperability and you'd have talk about information sharing and research and joint development, let's say, of weapon systems and defense platforms. So in that sense, the cooperation in the Indo-Pacific must begin from that context, from that sense of comfort and confidence about dealing with each other. Otherwise, it translates into very little, if we're not able to do that.
Can I just say a word about that? One of the subjects we talk about is why can't we make more progress in the defense relationship? Well, it's because India won't sign certain agreements that are still on the table that govern information sharing and classified information. We were able to sign one of them a couple years ago, but there's still 3 or 4 big ones that remain. And I guess one thing I would just say to and remind folks on the Indian side, and this came up in the course of our discussions, is that India is a tough negotiating partner, and India should come to the table with some degree of confidence that it doesn't need to give up its sovereignty, that it doesn't need to compromise its basic values, that it can protect its national interests and still enter into an information sharing agreement with the Americans. I remember when the objections about the logistics agreement came up, the Indian side kept saying, well, this is just going to allow you to base U.S. troops on Indian soil in times of crisis. And I said, well, you should write that into the agreement that we can never do that. And they said, okay, well, we will do that. And that's what should happen in an agreement. And my only point is that the government of India, the people of India, the country of India has a lot of authority now when it comes to sitting at the table, whether it's across from the Americans or any other partner. And they should come into those negotiations with confidence, and that these are not mutually inconsistent goals. These are very consistent goals to be closer to the U.S. and also maintain a very strong tradition in the security realm, of which India should be quite proud. I'll just do one other introduction. Alyssa Ayers, who came in, is also a task force member. Alyssa, you want to raise your hand? Also, a terrific author of a new book, Our Time Has Come. Is that right? Okay, good. So we're excited you're here. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think if I may add here about, from the American side, we all remember or we recall the kind of epiphany that George W. Bush had about the relationship and, the nuclear deal that came out of it. And similarly, and in the global context, and if India has to, have that strategic advantage, if we are to deal with the rise of China globally, I think the U.S. perhaps needs to really craft a strategy to ensure India's entry into the UN Security Council, because to my mind, that is one way of coming up against China in a meaningful manner.